I lived for years trapped under the control of my mother and husband. No one would believe what happened. I woke up every day feeling an invisible weight, as if the whole world depended on my approval, on my willingness to please. It was strange, but that feeling that nothing was enough became so natural that I didn't even realize how much I was fading away. My mother, Lucia, had a way of controlling everything without raising her voice. A subtle comment, a demand disguised as concern, and I found myself chasing something I might never have. My father, Sergio, always hid behind silence, letting guilt and fear become my internal prisons. He never said anything, never intervened, and this made me feel alone even at home. I was in my early 20s at the time, working in a small office and dealing with clients. But otherwise, my life revolved entirely around pleasing and not bothering. Every word I spoke, every decision, seemed filtered by the fear of displeasing someone. The feeling of being constantly watched and judged was constant. At work, I smiled even when I felt exhausted. With friends, I said yes even when I wanted to say no. At home, the dynamic was even crueler. My mother criticized every step, every choice, and my husband, Andre, who started out as affectionate and charming, slowly showed signs of control, small coldnesses, and comments that made me doubt myself. Little by little, my voice disappeared. I lacked the courage to express my desires or opinions. Every time I tried to assert myself, I received stares, criticism, or silent disapproval. It was as if the world was forcibly molding me, slowly stripping me of my identity. I began to realize that I no longer knew who I truly was, because I had spent years living to please, sacrificing my desires. Life seemed safe and peaceful to the outside world, but inside, I was increasingly empty, tired, and suffocated. The first signs that something needed to change came from a friend, Tanya. She sensed my discomfort, my lack of spark, and spoke about emotional freedom as if it were a possible reality, not just a distant fantasy. At first, I laughed at myself, thinking the situation was hopeless. But conversations with Tanya began to open windows into my mind. Each story she shared, each subtle piece of advice, made me realize I was trapped in an unnatural cycle. I began to question myself. Would it always be this way? Would my entire life be about pleasing others? These questions, though painful, began to create cracks in the wall of submission that surrounded me. I was afraid to face what lay behind these cracks, but there was also a silent desire for freedom, something I hadn't yet had the courage to name. I remember one particular afternoon at work when I looked at my reflection in the shop window and almost didn't recognize myself. The woman looking back at me had tired eyes, a hunched posture, and a drawn expression. It was a shock. I realized that years of submission, fear, and the need to please had robbed me not only of my voice, but of my very life. That moment was the beginning of an inner turmoil. It was painful to admit that, for too long, I had allowed other people to define who I was and what I could feel. It was also the moment I began to wonder if I would be able to change, if I could finally rebuild myself. But the fear of confronting my mother, my husband, and even my own behavioral patterns was still immense. The internal tension began to grow. Yet, even with the fear, something inside me began to rebel. Small decisions began to become acts of silent resistance, saying no in small situations, expressing the smallest opinions, choosing an outfit without consulting anyone. Each act seemed insignificant, but it reminded me that I still existed, that my identity hadn't been completely erased. This realization brought a mixture of hope and anxiety. I knew the path would be long and painful, but I also felt for the first time in years that there was a possibility of finding myself again. It felt like being on the edge of a precipice, but with a spark of courage burning within me. The next period of my life was marked by a mixture of courage and constant fear. Every small decision I made to regain my voice seemed to trigger an unexpected reaction at home. My mother, Lucia, began to show signs of dissatisfaction, albeit subtle ones, as if my newfound independence were a personal affront. Andre, my husband, who had once seemed like a safe haven, began to display coldness in responses that had previously been affectionate. That sense of security I had vanished, replaced by tension and anxiety. I found myself walking a tightrope, trying to maintain my emotional balance while trying not to provoke family outbursts. Each small step toward my freedom seemed to cost me twice as much effort, and I often wondered if it would be worth it. It was like learning to walk again after years of emotional confinement, and the fear of falling, paralyzed me, but there was something inside me that refused to give in completely. The feeling of loneliness was overwhelming. I felt as if I were silently fighting against invisible chains that bound me to patterns of submission I didn't even fully recognize. Tanya continued to be my anchor, the voice that reminded me there was life beyond this. Conversations with her were a refuge, but also a painful reminder of what I had lost through years of self-soothing. I began to question whether I would be able to break the cycle, whether I would ever regain my autonomy. Guilt and fear intertwined in my mind, suffocating. Every step toward freedom was accompanied by anxiety, and every step back into the old pattern brought me a sense of failure. The internal battle grew increasingly intense, and the feeling of near giving up began to visit me frequently. I reached a point where I questioned my own sanity. It was confusing to feel such a desire for freedom, and yet simultaneously fearful of losing it. At work, I tried to focus, but my mind constantly wandered between courageous decisions and thoughts of escape. At home, small arguments with Andre or indirect criticism from my mother turned into internal earthquakes, leaving me exhausted. The nights were the worst. Sitting in bed, unable to speak, I felt a tightness in my chest that seemed endless. I wondered, is it possible to change after so many years of submission? Can I trust myself to make choices without fear? The answer didn't yet exist, but the simple act of questioning was a step toward awareness and freedom. The tension grew with each passing day, and I knew something had to happen. It was during this period that I realized my small acts of resistance were no longer enough. Each time I gave in to pressure, I felt a piece of myself disappear. The need to please, which had previously been automatic, now became conscious, and it hurt. I began recording my thoughts, feelings, and desires, something that seemed simple but was revolutionary for me. Putting down what I felt and wanted on paper became an exercise in self-discovery. I noticed patterns, recognized manipulation, and understood how my own passivity had fueled those cycles of control. Journaling was a silent turning point, for it showed me that there was a self outside the influence of my mother and husband, a self that could still be rescued. The tension reached its peak one night when a small argument turned into a silent, hours-long confrontation. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally. Andre remained cold and distant, and my mother used every word, however indirect, to make me feel guilty. I felt on the verge of collapse, but something inside me refused to give in. A silent but firm voice telling me that I deserved more, that I didn't have to live trapped in fear and guilt. That night marked the point where I realized that my freedom wouldn't be granted, but earned, and that to achieve it, I would need courage, strength, and persistence. For the first time, I realized I was about to take the most important step of my life, to finally break the cycle that kept me trapped and begin to rebuild my identity. The turning point came on an ordinary morning, seemingly like any other, but ultimately extraordinary. I woke with a strange feeling, a mixture of exhaustion and determination. I looked in the mirror and for the first time saw myself through different eyes, observing not the woman who needed to please everyone, but the woman who wanted to find herself again. I remembered all the small flaws that taught me to hide my voice and my will, but this time, something changed. I felt there was no longer room for excuses or waiting for others' approval. It was at that moment that I decided it was time to act, that my life could no longer be shaped by the fears and demands of others. The decision wasn't grand or dramatic, but firm and silent, like a commitment to myself. I began to outline concrete steps to free myself, even though I still felt fear running down my spine. It was the first time in years that I felt in control of my own story. At work, I began to assert myself subtly, but definitively. I began to express my opinions, even though I trembled inside. Each small achievement brought me a sense of genuine power, something I hadn't felt in years. At home, the situation became a constant test. My mother made blaming and manipulative comments. Andre reacted with coldness and subtle criticism, trying to bring me back to my old patterns. Inside, anxiety and fear insisted on dominating me, but for the first time, I felt something stronger: self-confidence. I began to realize that freedom didn't come without resistance, but that it was possible to face it and grow with each challenge. Each choice to say no or stand up for myself was a silent but powerful victory that reaffirmed who I was. One of the most painful moments was facing my own guilt. For years, I was trained to feel responsible for the feelings of others, and this programming didn't disappear overnight. Every act of autonomy carried the weight of internal pressure, the fear of having harmed someone or of having failed as a daughter, wife, or friend. I felt like giving up many times, of returning to the comfort zone where fear was familiar. But something inside me kept insisting, you deserve to exist for yourself. The emotional pain was intense, but it also became fuel. Gradually, I realized that facing guilt and fear didn't mean being courageous without suffering, but allowing pain to be transformed into strength. Every tear shed, every moment of doubt, served to strengthen my inner roots. Tanya's support was crucial during this period. She became my external voice of courage, reminding me that I wasn't alone and that my struggle was valid. Our conversations helped me organize my thoughts, identify paths and strategies to face difficult situations without losing myself emotionally. More than that, she showed me that emotional freedom wasn't just about breaking up with people or situations, but about rebuilding my own self-esteem and self-confidence. I began writing letters that would never be sent, talking to myself, acknowledging my fears, and celebrating my small victories. This seemingly simple practice became a tool for reconstruction, allowing me to understand my patterns of submission and find alternative ways of reacting, making decisions, and expressing myself. It was the beginning of real transformation. Finally, the moment arrived when I had to confront Andre directly, without manipulation or mincing words. It was a long, tense, and emotionally charged conversation, where I finally made it clear that I would no longer accept the control, the coldness, and the silent pressure. He reacted with surprise and resistance, but I didn't back down. For the first time in a long time, I felt my body and mind aligned, working together toward my freedom. The feeling of fear was intense, but overcome by a solid determination. I was reclaiming my place in the world. That conversation was symbolic, because it represented the end of a cycle of submission and the beginning of my reconstruction. I left exhausted, but with a sense of power and hope I hadn't felt in years. The first great victory over myself and fear had been achieved. After that decisive conversation with Andre, I realized my life was beginning to change in concrete ways. It wasn't an instant transformation, but every action I took now carried the awareness that I had a choice, that my desires mattered. I began to set clear boundaries, communicate my needs, and most importantly, listen to my own voice. The feeling of reclaiming my identity was both liberating and frightening at the same time. Often, the fear of feeling guilty or disappointing someone still lingered, but with each small decision, that fear became more manageable. I began giving myself permission to exist without justification, and this brought a lightness I hadn't even remembered feeling. It was a gradual process, built with small steps that added up to significant achievements. My relationship with my mother remained challenging. Lucia didn't accept my changes well, and this created moments of tension. But instead of feeling defeated, I began to realize that her resistance didn't have to define my reaction. I learned to distance myself emotionally from manipulative comments, maintaining my composure, and reaffirming my autonomy. This ability to create internal boundaries was one of the greatest lessons learned. I began to realize that emotional freedom didn't mean the absence of conflict, but the ability to face it without being swallowed by it. Every conversation, every difficult situation was now an opportunity to exercise courage and self-confidence, reinforcing that I could exist on my own without fear or excessive guilt. At work, I began to stand out in a different way. I began to present my ideas with confidence, propose projects, and establish healthy boundaries in my daily routine. Colleagues noticed my change and began to respect me more genuinely. My self-confidence was reflected in concrete actions, demonstrating that my transformation was not only internal, but also visible externally. I felt proud of each step, but without deluding myself. There were still difficult days, emotional setbacks, and moments of insecurity. The difference was that now I knew I could handle them without losing myself. The sense of control over my life grew with each decision I made. Conversations with Tanya continued to be crucial. She helped me process emotions, analyze old patterns, and plan how to maintain the freedom I'd gained. I learned to recognize signs of manipulation and react consciously, without aggression, but with firmness. This learning gave me the confidence to create a broader support network, including friends and coworkers who respected my voice. I began to realize that emotional freedom was also about choosing healthy relationships, and rejecting those who seek to impose control or guilt. This shift in perspective was liberating. My life began to be guided by conscious choices, rather than by the fear of displeasing. With each day, I felt my inner space expand. Simple activities like going out alone, taking courses, or deciding on my career without consulting anyone became acts of empowerment. I began to feel pleasure in small, everyday achievements, something that had been stifled by years of submission. The transformation was not only emotional, but physical. My posture changed, my gaze gained firmness, and my voice gradually returned, with courage and authenticity. Each day was a reaffirmation that I could exist without fear, that my life could be my own, and that I no longer needed to live under the control of others. The reconstruction was real, palpable, and profoundly liberating. Over time, I realized that my life had transformed profoundly and irreversibly. Each challenge I faced taught me something valuable about myself, my strength, and my limits. The freedom I gained didn't mean an absence of difficulties, but rather the ability to deal with them without losing myself. I learned to acknowledge my emotions without guilt, to value myself, and to prioritize my needs without fear of judgment. A sense of autonomy became part of who I am, and each conscious choice reinforced my identity. For the first time in years, I felt my life was truly in my hands. My relationship with my mother and husband changed, though not always harmoniously. Lucia remained controlling, and Andre still displayed cold streaks, but I no longer allowed them to determine my well-being. I created clear and firm boundaries and discovered that my inner peace depended more on my attitude than on theirs. This realization gave me the strength to stand firm in the face of old situations that would previously have crushed me emotionally. The freedom I achieved came not from their change, but from a change in myself, in how I saw myself, and how I reacted to the world. Furthermore, I reconnected with myself in ways I never imagined possible. I began to invest in my interests, hobbies, and dreams, activities that had previously been pushed aside due to the desire to please. Every achievement, no matter how small, was proof that I could exist without depending on others' approval. My self-confidence grew to the point where I allowed myself to dream again, to feel like I was in control of my own story. I discovered that true transformation happens when you learn to love and respect yourself, regardless of outside opinions. Sharing this experience with Tanya, close friends, and even online communities brought even more meaning to my journey. Realizing that my story could inspire others to break cycles of submission, I felt my pain transform into purpose. I learned that, although the journey is lonely at times, the courage to rediscover and rebuild oneself can generate profound connections and transformations. Each step taken, each challenge faced, reinforced that it was possible to break free and be happy, even after years of control and manipulation. Today, I can honestly say that my life has changed. Challenges still exist, but the difference is that now I have the tools, confidence, and clarity to face them. I discovered my voice, learned to respect my limits, and above all, to believe in myself. The freedom I've achieved is daily, and each conscious choice is a celebration of this victory. It's not a story of perfection, but of real courage, genuine overcoming, and self-love. Today, I finally know that it's possible to exist without fear and live for yourself, step by step, decision by decision.